Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
All right, we're live. Greg, thank you so much.
Glad to be here, wherever here is.
So, I'll just go right into it. When did you first meet my mom and Avram and all that history? I'd just love to know.
I met them both in the glorious 60s, 1960s, not my 60s, and in the Bay Area, because I had migrated to California to go to graduate school in 63, and I went up to the Bay Area and met them at various cons and parties and so forth. The moving house party that was science fiction fandom in that era. I always liked Avram's work. Of course, I'd read a great deal of it already. And Grania was unique. I've really never known anyone quite like Grania. I think they broke the mold, so to speak. And Avram, I actually managed to find a way to help because I went to UCSD in 63. I got my doctorate in 67. Edward Teller offered me a postdoc position at Livermore for 2 years, and then 2 years in as a staff member at Livermore Lab. But in that era, I saw Avram all the time because he was all around, and it was a huge flowing community of people. All the East Coast major people had moved to the Bay Area, and aside from driving up real estate prices, they also had great parties. So I saw Avram a lot, and then I got an offer from UC Irvine. What was it? 4 years after my PhD, to be a professor here, and I was reluctant, but I realized suddenly I could live in Laguna Beach, so that decided it, and I moved here. And only a few months after I arrived in the physics department as an assistant professor, there was a memo circulated to all faculty saying, we have a student-appointed faculty program here, but the students, as usual, lazy and slothful and and ignorant. Of course, that's when they come in, maybe when they go out too. But anyway, they hadn't appointed or nominated enough people who passed muster. So the memo said, do you have anybody in mind who would fit? And by pure coincidence, I think maybe from talking to Grania or my brother, who has spoken to her, I realized that Avram was in serious financial trouble. This is 1972, something like that, spring. And so I knew his career, and I thought he might fit, and I thought, I could solve two problems here. So I wrote a short summary of his career. Remember, this is pre-internet, right? I had to take it out of my actual own software in the head.
Right.
And sent it to the committee, and they called me up within hours and said, hey, this guy sounds good. How do we reach him? And blah, blah. And within a matter of days, you could tell how long ago it was because things happened quickly. And there was not a foot of paperwork involved. He had the appointment. He had never done any teaching of this kind before, but he was a huge hit. When
how did that go? What was that like? I'm so curious.
Well, he flew down, and the university treats you very well if you're a visiting professor. You get picked up at the airport. There's an apartment for you, actually only a few hundred meters from my present house downhill on the campus. So he could walk to the English department where we had an office. And he taught courses in how to write fiction. And he got huge ratings. Everybody loved it. No one had ever, apparently, in the English department had someone who knew really very much about English. That is, this guy knew how to write. And he was largely untutored from Yonkers.
Right.
And so he was very popular, and people invited him to give talks, and he was in his element. Faculty invited him to dinner. I had him to our house in Laguna Beach a number of times. And he said, I remember memorably, he walked out on our deck and said, "Gosh, I don't think I've ever seen the ocean when it was so big." And that's a metaphor somewhere there. And anyway, he impressed them a great deal. And toward the end of it, when he was going to fly back up to the Bay Area and stuff, he said, I made enough on this gig to last me the rest of the year, because he was living very scrupulously. He seemed to have a crackers and peanut butter diet going, but he ate very well here. I said, there are other such programs in other universities. Why don't you go look it up and see what's there? Because I knew really next to nothing about it. He had talked to a few people in the department by that time, so he knew something. And so he put out his shingle, more or less, and he got a whole host of places, some of them for longer periods than 1 quarter, which is 10 weeks, and taught at I don't know how many places. I occasionally would get a postcard saying, "Hey, scored another one," like I'm at University of Texas in someplace like Laredo or something.
Yep.
And they offered me to, a whole big longer gig, and he was really happy. And it really helped his career. He didn't die until the early 90s, as I recall, but he spent a lot of time in the 70s and into the 80s teaching at universities and spreading his fame. I told him, "Why don't you get a regular faculty position?" But somehow he never did. I don't know that story. Maybe Grania did, because of course they'd broken up by that time.
Right.
And then came the Steve decades.
Could he have, I'm just curious, could he have got, with his educational background, could he have gotten a full-time?
Oh, sure. They don't expect writers to know anything.
Okay. So with getting to know Avram, any funny stories that you'd want to share?
He was a teetotaler who, well, he said he was, who, if he got this much wine or something, seemed to completely change his faith. He became loquacious and expansive and all this stuff. And it was an interesting trigger. It just shows that you really have to train to be an alcoholic. Years of training. People overlook it, but it does take that. I can speak for some experience. And he also had a way of talking at a party in a small voice. I think he used that term, small voice, a rather hushed, somewhat accented, Yonkers kind of accent, mingled with the Old Testament. And people would fall quiet to listen to him. He had this interesting, quiet charisma. People wanted to hear what Avram had to say because it was always well considered and erudite. And this is the guy whose education was, I don't even know how much.
I still have to figure that out. That's Ethan has a theory on that, which I can talk about in a second, but go on.
Well, he was self-educated largely. Everybody is, a large fraction of the people in early science fiction were self-educated. They weren't people like me with PhDs. And I would point out to you that Shakespeare quit after grammar school. So you would never guess that this guy was a combat medic in the Marines in World War II. He didn't have that persona.
No.
And I never got him to talk about it. Did you?
I never did. For me, he was very much, I know he spoke about it a little bit with Ethan, but not very much. I think he saw some things that he didn't want to talk about.
Well, he would drop occasional words like Saipan and corregidor that let you know that there was a whole chapter of his life there that you were not going to hear about.
I also get the impression from Ethan that maybe because he was trying as much as possible to stick to being Orthodox, that it was hard for him in the military as well, trying to keep up during World War II as an Orthodox Jew, it was sort of lonely. So I think that
Yeah.
that was, I think, part of it as well.
Yeah. Well, first it meant you couldn't eat spam.
Well, that could have been tough.
Guess the first thing that occurred to me. But I used to tell him about some of my graduate students who were Israelis and had sort of the same experience, except they were fighting for Israel. And they said, we have an easy way to keep Orthodox here, but the Orthodox have their own lobby and you can do all this in the Israeli army, but the U.S. Marines were not so picky.
Yeah, well, you know that he also served during the Israeli war, a short war as well, as a man.
I didn't know that. You mean the first one in 48?
I think so, yeah.
Boy, this is a man of mystery. It really is. I mean, I don't think he ever mentioned that.
Yeah. So that was another conflict he was involved in.
Yeah.
That was probably a little easier for him, at least in terms of being able to stay kosher.
Of course. Well, I've had 7 PhDs who are Israelis, and a special program that we set up with Israel to we could get PhDs for people in physics in 3 years, guaranteed, for your money back. And it always worked. We did it for 24 people. I'm a hardline Zionist, by the way.
So in terms of when you first discovered Avram, any favorite story, any particular story that stood out to you, that caught your attention before you met him? I mean, is there a story that really resonated with you?
Well, there's so many. Particularly short stories, but the magical ones. Why can't I remember the names? Those were good too.
You mean the Virgil? The Virgil?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay. The Virgil, right. I mean, that's an area of history that was hard to tell what was fiction and what wasn't. It was so strange. But he did it so masterfully. And, one of the reasons he caught on in our English department was this guy was a real scholar.
Right.
I mean, you suspected that he knew Archimedes or somebody, he would just lightly offhand refer to something. I saw him do this at faculty dinner parties and refer to something that was way over here. And hardly anybody at the table knew. And he would just refer to it as though, Archimedes lived down the block. He had a gift for that kind of thing. Casual, elegant knowledge. And he was not an academic, which I think is really certainly a good qualifier.
Yeah. And in terms of a short story, any particular favorite short story that jumps out?
The Sea Like Oysters.
Okay. And you wrote, how about the Now Let Us Sleep? You wrote in the Treasury.
Yes, right.
You wrote the.
Keep that out just because. Who was it? Grania asked me. She said, "I said, what do you think I'd be interested in?" And here's this story, and I couldn't remember whether I'd read it or not, but I really liked it a lot. And it was pleasant to be in that anthology. I've got it right upstairs, and to read things in there I'd never read before, and I really liked the notes on it too.
So Greg and I were having so much fun on our call that we never actually got to the story, and I decided it would make sense to insert Now Let Us Sleep, which was originally recorded in September, or published originally in 1957 of the September issue of Venture Science Fiction magazine. It's a sad story about genocide. It takes place in space, but it does remind me a lot of Or the Grasses Grow, which takes place here on Earth. I recommend reading them both. But anyways, I'm also going to include the introduction by Greg Benford that was also in the Treasury. I hope you enjoy it. And then after this, we'll continue my conversation with Greg Benford. Hope you guys are enjoying. Thanks so much.
Now Let Us Sleep. A pink-skinned young cadet ran past Harper, laughing and shouting and firing his stun gun. The wind veered about, throwing the thick scent of the yahoos into the faces of the men, who whooped loudly to show their revulsion. "I got 3, the chicken cadet yelped at Harper. "Did you see me pop those 2 together? Boy, what a stink they have!" Harper looked at the sweating kid, muttered, "You don't smell so sweet yourself." But the cadet didn't wait to hear. All the men were running now, running in a ragged semicircle, with the intention of driving the yahoos before them, to hold them at bay at the foot of the gaunt cliff a quarter mile off. The yahoos loped awkwardly over the rough terrain, moaning and grunting grotesquely, their naked bodies bent low. A few 100 feet ahead, one of them stumbled and fell, his arms and legs flying out as he hit the ground, twitched, and lay still. A bald-headed passenger laughed triumphantly, paused to kick the yahoo, and trotted on. Harper kneeled beside the fallen primitive, felt for a pulse in the hairy wrist. It seemed slow and feeble, but then no one actually knew what the normal pulse beat should be. And except for Harper, no one seemed to give a damn. Maybe it was because he was the grandson of Barrett Harper, the great naturalist, back on Earth, of course. It seemed as if man could be fond of nature only on the planet of man's origin, whose ways he knew so well. Elsewhere, it was too strange and alien. You subdued it, or you adjusted to it, or you were perhaps even content with it. But you almost never cared about the flora or fauna of the new planets. No one had the feeling for living things that an Earthborn had. The men were shouting more loudly now, but Harper didn't lift his head to see why. He put his hand to the shaggy gray chest. The heart was still beating, but very slowly and irregularly. Someone stood beside him. "He'll come out of it in an hour or so," the voice of the purser said. "Come on, you'll miss all the fun. You should see how they act when they're cornered. They kick out and throw sand, and—" He laughed at the thought. "They weep great big tears and go, 'Oof, oof.'" Harper said, "An ordinary man would come out of it in an hour or so, but I think their metabolism is different. Look at all the bones lying around." The purser spat. "Well, don't that prove they're not human when they won't even bury their dead? Oh, look at that," he swore. Harper got to his feet. Cries of dismay and disappointment went up from the men. "What's wrong?" Harper asked. The purser pointed. The men had stopped running, were gathering together and gesturing. "Who's the damn fool who planned this drive?" the purser asked angrily. "He picked the wrong cliff. The damned yahoos nest in that one. Look at them climb, will you?" He took aim, fired the stun gun. A figure scrabbling up the side of the rock threw up its arms and fell, bounding from rock to rock until it hit the ground. "That one will never come out of it," the purser said with satisfaction. But this was the last casualty. The other yahoos made their way to safety in the caves and crevices. No one followed them. In those narrow, stinking confines, a yahoo was as good as a man, and there was no room to aim a stun gun, and the yahoos had rocks and clubs and their own sharp teeth. The men began straggling back. "This one a she?" The purser pushed at the body with his foot, let it fall back with an annoyed grunt as soon as he determined its sex. "There'll be hell to pay in the hold if there's more than 2 convicts to a she." He shook his head and swore. 2 lighters came skimming down from the big ship to load up. "Coming back to the launch?" the purser asked. He had a red, shiny face. Harper had always thought him a rather decent fellow. Before. The purser had no way of knowing what was in Harper's mind. He smiled at him and said, "We might as well get on back. The fun's over now." Harper came to a sudden decision. "What are the chances of my taking a souvenir back with me? This big fellow here, for example." The purser seemed doubtful. "Well, I don't know, Mr. Harper. We're only supposed to take females aboard and unload them as soon as the convicts are finished with their fun." He leered. Harper, suppressing a strong urge to hit him right in the middle of his apple-red face, put his hand in his pocket. The purser understood, looked away as Harper slipped a bill into the breast pocket of his uniform. "I guess it can be arranged. See, the Commissioner General on Selope 3 wants one for his private zoo. I'll tell you what. We'll take one for him and one for you. I'll tell the supercargo it's a spare. But if one croaks, the CG has to get the other, okay?" At Harper's nod, the purser took a tag out of his pocket, tied it around the yahoo's wrist, waved his cap to the lighter as it came near. "Although why anybody'd want one of these beats me," he said cheerfully. "They're dirtier than animals. I mean, a pig or a horse will use the same corner of the enclosure, but these things will dirty anywhere. Still, if you want one—" He shrugged. As soon as the lighter had picked up the limp form, the pulse was still fluttering feebly. Harper and the purser went back to the passenger launch. As they made a swift ascent to the big ship, the purser gestured to the two lighters. "That's going to be a mighty slow trip those two craft will make back up," he remarked. Harper innocently asked why. The purser chuckled. The coxswain laughed. "The freight crewmen want to make their points before the convicts, that's why." The chicken cadet, his face flushed a deeper pink than usual, tried to sound knowing. "How about that, purser? Is it pretty good stuff?" The other passengers wiped their perspiring faces, leaned forward eagerly. The purser said, "Well, rank has its privileges, but that's one I figure I can do without." His listeners guffawed, but more than one looked down toward the lighters and then avoided other eyes when he looked back again. Barnum's Planet, named, as was the custom then, after the skipper who'd first sighted it, was a total waste, economically speaking. It was almost all water, and the water supported only a few repulsive-looking species of no discernible value. The only sizable piece of land, known, inevitably, as Barnum Land, since no one else coveted the honor, was gaunt and bleak, devoid alike of useful minerals or arable soil. Its ecology seemed dependent on a sort of fly. A creature rather like a lizard ate the flies, and the yahoos ate the lizards. If something died at sea and washed ashore, the yahoos ate that too. What the flies ate no one knew, but their larvae ate the yahoos dead. They were small, hairy, stunted creatures whose speech, if speech it was, seemed confined to moans and clicks and grunts. They wore no clothing, made no artifacts, did not know the use of fire. Taken away captive, they soon languished and died. Of all the primitives discovered by man, they were the most primitive. They might have been left alone on their useless planet to kill lizards with tree branches forever, except for one thing. Barnum's Planet lay equidistant between Coulter's system and the Celopes, and it was a long, long voyage either way. Passengers grew restless, crews grew mutinous, convicts rebellious. Gradually, the practice developed of stopping on Barnum's Planet to let off steam. Archaic expression, but although the nature of the machinery man used had changed since it was coined, man's nature hadn't. And of course, no one owned Barnum's Planet, so no one cared what happened there, which was just too bad for the yahoos. It took some time for Harper to settle the paperwork concerning his souvenir, but finally he was given a baggage check for one Yahoo mail live and hurried down to the freight deck. He hoped it would be still alive. Pandemonium met his ears as he stepped out of the elevator. A rhythmical, chanting shout came from the convict hold. "Hear that?" one of the duty officers asked him, taking the cargo chit. Harper asked what the men were yelling. "I wouldn't care to use the words," the officer said. He was a paunchy, gray-haired man, one who probably loved to tell his grandchildren about his adventures. This was one he wouldn't tell them. "I don't like this part of the detail," the officer went on. "Never did, never will. Those creatures seem human to me, stupid as they are. And if they're not human," he asked, "then how can we sink low enough to bring their females up for the convicts?" The lighters grated on the landing. The noise must have penetrated to the convict hold, because all semblance of words vanished from the shouting. It became a mad cry, louder and louder. "Here's your pet," the gray-haired officer said. "Still out, I see. I'll let you have a baggage carrier. Just give it to a steward when you're done with it." He had to raise his voice to be heard over the frenzied howling from the hold. The ship's surgeon was out having tea at the captain's table. The duty medical officer was annoyed. "What, another one? We're not veterinarians, you know. Well, wheel him in. My intern is working on the other one." "Whoa!" He held his nose and hastily left. The intern, a pale young man with close-cropped dark hair, looked up from the pressure spray he had just used to give an injection to the specimen Yahoo selected for the Commissioner General of Celope 3. He smiled faintly. "Junior will have company, I see. Any others?" Harper shook his head. The intern went on. This should be interesting. The young one seems to be in shock. I gave him 2 cc's of antidar sulfate, and I see I'd better do the same for yours. Then, well, I guess there's still nothing like serum albumin, is there? But you'd better help me strap them down. If they come to, there's a cell back aft we can put them in until I can get some cages rigged up. He shot the stimulant into the flaccid arm of Harper's Yahoo. Whoever named these beasties knew his Swift, the young medico said. You ever read that old book, Gulliver's Travels? Harper nodded. Old Swift went mad, didn't he? He hated humanity. They all seemed like yahoos to him. In a way, I don't blame him. I think that's why everybody despises these primitives. They seem like caricatures of ourselves. Personally, I look forward to finding out a lot about them, their metabolism, and so on. What's your interest? He asked the question casually, but shot a keen look as he did so. Harper shrugged. I hardly know exactly. It's not a scientific one because I'm a businessman. He hesitated. You ever hear or read about the Tasmanians? The intern shook his head. He thrust a needle into a vein in the younger Yahoo's arm, preparing to let the serum flow in. If they lived on Earth, I wouldn't know. Never was there. I'm a third-generation Coulter boy myself. Harper said, Tasmania is an island south of Australia. The natives were the most primitive people known to Earth. They were almost all wiped out by the settlers, but one of them succeeded in moving the survivors to a smaller island, and then a curious thing happened. Looking up from the older primitive, the intern asked what that was. The Tasmanians, the few that were left, decided that they'd had it. They refused to breed, and in a few more years they were all dead. I read about them when I was just a kid. Somehow it moved me very much. Things like that did. The dodo, the great auk, the quagga, the Tasmanians. I've never been able to get it out of my mind. When I began hearing about the Yahoos, it seemed to me that they were like the old Tasmanians, only there are no settlers on Barnum Land. The intern nodded. But that won't help our hairy friends here a hell of a lot. Of course, no one knows how many of them there are, or ever were, but I've been comparing the figures in the log as to how many females are caught and taken aboard. He looked directly at Harper. And on every trip, there are less by far. Harper bowed his head. He nodded. The intern's voice went on. The thing is, Barnum's planet is no one's responsibility. If the Yahoos could be used for labor, they'd be exploited according to a careful system. But as it is, no one cares. If half of them die from being stun-gunned, no one cares. If the lighter crews don't bother to actually land the females, if any of the wretched creatures are still alive when the convicts are done, but just dump them out from 20 feet up, why, again, no one cares. Mr. Harper? Their eyes met. Harper said, Yes. Don't misunderstand me. I've got a career here. I'm not jeopardizing it to save the poor Yahoos. But if you are interested, if you think you've got any influence, and if you want to try to do anything, he paused. Why, now is the time to start, because after another few stopovers, there aren't going to be any Yahoos, no more than there are any Tasmanians. Celope 3 was called the Autumn Planet by the poets. At least the PR picture tapes always referred to it as Celope 3, the Autumn Planet of the Poets, but no one knew who the poets were. It was true that the Commission territory at least did have the climate of an almost perpetual early New England November. Barnum Land had been dry and warm. The Commissioner General put the 2 Yahoos in a heated cage as large as the room Harper occupied at his company's bachelor executive quarters. Here, boy, the CG said, holding out a piece of fruit. He made a chirping noise. The 2 Yahoos huddled together in a far corner. They don't seem very bright, he said sadly. All my other animals eat out of my hand. He was very proud of his private zoo, the only one in the territory. On Sundays, he allowed the public to visit it. Sighing, Harper repeated that the Yahoos were primitives, not animals. But seeing the CG was still doubtful, he changed his tactics. He told the CG about the great zoos on Earth, where the animals went loose in large enclosures rather than being caged up. The CG nodded thoughtfully. Harper told him of the English dukes who, generation after ducal generation, preserved the last herd of wild white cattle in a park on their estate. The CG stroked his chin. Yes, he said. I see your point, he said. He sighed gustily. Can't be done, he said. But why not, sir? Harper cried. It was simple. No money. Who's to pay? The Exchequer Commissioner is weeping blood trying to get the budget through Council. If he adds a penny more, no, young fellow, I'll do what I can. I'll feed these two here, but that's all I can do. Trying to pull all the strings he could reach, Harper approached the Executive Fiscal and the Procurator General, the President in Council, the Territorial Advocate, the Chairman of the Board of Travel, but no one could do anything. Barnum's planet, it was carefully explained to him, remained no man's land only because no man presumed to give any orders concerning it. If any government did, this would be a presumption of authority, and then every other government would feel obliged to deny that presumption and issue a claim of its own. There was a peace on now, a rather tense, uneasy one, and it wasn't going to be disturbed for Harper's yahoos. Human were they, perhaps, but who cared? As for morality, Harper didn't even bother to mention the word. It would have meant as little as chivalry. Meanwhile, he was learning something of the Yahoo's language. Slowly and arduously he gained their confidence. They would shyly take food from him. He persuaded the CG to knock down a wall and enlarge their quarters. The official was a kindly old man, and he seemed to grow fond of the stooped, shaggy, splay-footed primitives. And after a while he decided that they were smarter than animals. "Put some clothes on 'em, Harper," he directed. "If they're people, let 'em start acting like people. They're too big to go around naked." So, eventually, washed and dressed, Junior and Senior were introduced to civilization via 3D, and the program was taped and shown everywhere. "Would you like a cigarette, Junior? Here, let me light it for you. Give Junior a glass of water, Senior. Let's see you take off your slippers, fellows, and put them on again. And now do what I say in your own language." But if Harper thought that might change public opinion, he thought wrong. Seals perform too, don't they? And so do monkeys. They talk? Parrots talk better. And anyway, who cares to be bothered about animals or primitives? They were okay for fun, but that was all. And the reports from Barnum Land showed fewer and fewer yahoos each time. Then one night, 2 drunken crewmen climbed over the fence and went carousing in the CG's zoo. Before they left, they broke the vapor light tubes, and in the morning Junior and Senior were found dead from the poisonous fumes. That was Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon Harper was drunk, and getting drunker. The men who knocked on his door got no answer. They went in anyway. He was slouched, red-eyed over the table. "People," he muttered. "Tell you they were human," he shouted. "Yes, Mr. Harper, we know that," said a young man, pale, with close-cropped dark hair. Harper peered at him boozily. "No, you," he said. "Third-generation Coulter boy. Go away, spoil your career. What for? Smelly old Yahoo." The young medico nodded to his companion, who took a small flask from his pocket, opened it. They held it under Harper's nose by main force. He gasped and struggled, but they held on, and in a few minutes he was sober. "That's rough stuff," he said, coughing and shaking his head. "But thanks, Dr. Hill. Your ship in, or are you stopping over?" The former intern shrugged. "I've left the ships," he said. "I don't have to worry about spoiling my new career. This is my superior, Dr. Anscombe." Anscombe was also young, and like most men from Coulter's system, pale. He said, "I understand you can speak the Yahoo's language." Harper winced. "What good's that now? They're dead, poor little bastards." Anscombe nodded. "I'm sorry about that, believe me. Those fumes are so quick. But there are still a few alive on Barnum's planet who can be saved. The Joint Board for Research is interested. Are you?" It had taken Harper 15 years to work up to a room of this size and quality in bachelor executives' quarters. He looked around it. He picked up the letter which had come yesterday. Neglected your work and become a joke, unless you accept a transfer and reduction in grade. He nodded slowly, putting down the letter. I guess I've already made my choice. What are your plans? Harper, Hill, and Anscombe sat on a hummock on the north coast of Barnum Land, just out of rock-throwing range of the gaunt escarpment of the cliff which rose before them. Behind them a tall fence had been erected. The only Yahoos still alive were nesting in the caves of the cliff. Harper spoke into the amplifier again. His voice was hoarse as he forced it into the clicks and moans of the primitive's tongue. Hill stirred restlessly. Are you sure that means here is food, here is water, and not come down and let us eat you? I think I can almost say it myself by now. Shifting and stretching, Anscombe said, It's been 2 days. Unless they've determined to commit race suicide a bit more abruptly than your ancient Tasmanians. He stopped as Harper's fingers closed tightly on his arm. There was a movement on the cliff, a shadow. A pebble clattered. Then a wrinkled face peered fearfully over a ledge. Slowly, and with many stops and hesitations, a figure came down the face of the cliff. It was an old she. Her withered and pendulous dugs flapped against her sagging belly as she made the final jump to the ground and, her back to the wall of rock, faced them. Here is food, Harper repeated softly. Here is water. The old woman sighed. She plodded wearily across the ground, paused, shaking with fear, and then flung herself down at the food and the water. The Joint Board for Research has just won the first round, Hill said. Anscombe nodded. He jerked his thumb upward. Hill looked. Another head appeared at the cliff, then another, and another. They watched. The crone got up, water dripping from her dewlaps. She turned to the cliff. Come down, she cried. Here is food and water. Do not die. Come down and eat and drink. Slowly her tribespeople did so. There were 30 of them. Harper asked, Where are the others? The crone held out her dried and leathery breasts to him. Where are those who have sucked? Where are those your brothers took away? She uttered a single shrill wail, then was silent. But she wept, and Harper wept with her. I'll guess we'll swing it all right, Hill said. Anscombe nodded. Pity there's so few of them. I was afraid we'd have to use gas to get at them. Might have lost several that way. Neither of them wept. For the first time since ships had come to their world, Yahoos walked aboard one. They came hesitantly and fearfully, but Harper had told them that they were going to a new home, and they believed him. He told them that they were going to a place of much food and water, where no one would hunt them down. He continued to talk until the ship was on its way, and the last primitive had fallen asleep under the dimmed-out vapor tube lights. Then he staggered to his cabin and fell asleep himself. He slept for 30 hours. He had something to eat when he awoke, then strolled down to the hold where the primitives were. He grimaced, remembering his trip to the hold of the other ship to collect Senior and the frenzied howling of the convicts awaiting the females. At the entrance to the hold, he met Dr. Hill, greeted him. I'm afraid some of the Yahoos are sick, Hill said, but Dr. Anscombe is treating them. The others have been moved to this compartment here. Harper stared. Sick? How can they be sick? What from? And how many? Dr. Hill said, It appears to be virulent plague. 15 of them are down with it. You've had all 6 shots, haven't you? Good. Nothing to worry. Harper felt the cold steal over him. He stared at the pale young physician. No one can enter or leave any system or planet without having had all 6 shots for virulent plague, he said slowly. So if we are all immune, how could the primitives have gotten it? And how is it that only 15 have it? Exactly half of them. What about the other 15, Dr. Hill? Are they the control group for your experiment? Dr. Hill looked at him calmly. As a matter of fact, yes. I hope you'll be reasonable. Those were the only terms the Joint Board for Research would agree to. After all, not even convicts will volunteer for experiments in virulent plague. Harper nodded. He felt frozen. After a moment, he asked, Can Anscombe do anything to pull them through? Dr. Hill raised his eyebrows. Perhaps. We've got something we wanted to try. And at any rate, the reports should provide additional data on the subject. We must take the long-range view. Harper nodded. I suppose you're right, he said. By noon, all 15 were dead. Well, that means an uneven control group, Dr. Anscombe complained. 7 against 8. Still, that's not too bad, and it can't be helped. We'll start tomorrow. Virulent plague again? Harper asked. Anscombe and Hill shook their heads. Dehydration, the latter said. And after that, there's a new treatment for burns we're anxious to try. It's a shame when you think of the yahoos being killed off by the thousands, year after year, uselessly, like the dodo. We came along just in time, thanks to you, Harper. He gazed at them. Quis custodiat ipsos custodis? He asked. They looked at him, politely blank. I'd forgotten. Doctors don't study Latin anymore, do they? An old proverb. It means, who shall guard the guards themselves? Will you excuse me, doctors? Harper let himself into the compartment. I come, he greeted the 15. We see, they responded. The old woman asked how their brothers and sisters were in the other cave. They are well. Have you eaten? Have you drunk? Yes? Then let us sleep, Harper said. The old woman seemed doubtful. Is it time? The light still shines. She pointed to it. Harper looked at her. She had been so afraid, but she had trusted him. Suddenly he bent over and kissed her. She gaped. Now the light goes out, Harper said. He slipped off a shoe and shattered the vapor tube. He groped in the dark for the air switch, turned it off. Then he sat down. He had brought them here, and if they had to die, it was only fitting that he should share their fate. There no longer seemed any place for the helpless or for those who cared about them. Now let us sleep, he said.
Now Let Us Sleep. Introduction by Gregory Benford. When Now Let Us Sleep first appeared, it excited a fine reaction. The dark issues it confronts lie deep within us. Since its publication, we have learned much about our origins, our connections to the other primates, and implications for our own lot in the universe. Consider the chimpanzees. We separated from them genetically about 6 million years ago, and differ by less than 2% in our DNA. We've patched together from field observation and evolutionary logic a picture of how they, and we, evolved our social behaviors. The issues of this story arise from a conflict between Avram's clear liberal sympathies and the nagging knowledge that maybe our core natures conflict. This is dismaying news indeed. Let me sketch some of the perspectives from a scientific view to outline the problems. Chimpanzees move in small groups, disliking outsiders, breeding mostly within their modest circle of a few dozen. This meant that any genetic trait that emerged could pass swiftly into all the members through inbreeding. If it helped the band survive, the rough rub of chance would select for that band's survival. But the trait had to be undiluted. A troop of especially good rock throwers would get swallowed up if they joined a company of several hundred, their genetic heritage watered down. What to do? Striking a balance between the accidents of genetics in small groups and the stability of large groups. That was the trick, we believe. Some lucky troop might have genetic traits that fit the next challenge handed out by the ever-altering world. They did well. With some outbreeding, that trait got spread into other bands. Down through the strainer of time, others picked up the trait. It spread. So small bands held fast to their eccentric traits, and some prospered. Evolutionary jumps happened faster in small, semi-isolated bands, which outbred slightly. They kept their genetic assets in one small basket, the troop. The price was steep, a strong preference for their own tiny lot. This would lead to a species that hated crowds, strangers, general alienness. Nature, then, did not produce a natural liberal. Bands of less than 10 were too vulnerable to disease or predators. A few losses, and the group failed. Too many, and they lost the concentration of close breeding. They were intensely loyal to their group, identifying each other in the dark by smell. Because they had many common genes, altruistic actions were common. This meant even heroism, for even if the hero died, his shared genes were passed on through his relatives. So it was actually helpful to develop smoldering animosity to outsiders, an immediate sense of their wrongness. Even if strangers could pass the tests of difference in appearances, manner, smell, grooming, even then, culture could amplify the effects. Newcomers with different language or dress, or habits and posture, would seem repulsive. Anything that served to distinguish a band would keep hatreds high. Each small genetic ensemble would then be driven by natural selection to stress the non-inherited differences, even arbitrary ones, dimly connected to survival fitness, and so they evolved culture. Diversity in their tribal intricacies avoided genetic watering down. They heeded the ancient call of aloof, wary tribalism. Does this chimp scenario fit us? Some resemblances are striking. After all, we still resemble the common chimps and pygmy chimps. We're just bigger and with less hair, walking upright. The visible differences between us and chimps were far less than, say, between Great Danes and Chihuahuas. Yet dogs interbreed. We and chimps do not. In nature, genocide occurs in wolves and chimps alike. Murder is widespread. Further afield, ducks and orangutans rape. Ants have organized warfare and slave raids. The Walt Disney World never existed. Chimps in the field have at least as good a chance of being murdered as did humans. Of all the hallowed human hallmarks, speech, art, technology, and the rest, the one that comes most obviously from animal ancestors is genocide. Human tribes may well have evolved as a group defense, clubbiness against clubs. Luckily, today's worldwide instantaneous communication blurs distinctions between us and them, blunting the deep impulse to genocide. Our biological baggage of dark behaviors includes delight in torture and easy exterminations of other species for short-term gain. Against such Darwinian imperatives, willed to us by vast time, we can muster only our intuitive values. Avram knew this, and so framed his story as a quiet affirmation of solidarity with the other. A noble sentiment, and one which may well have eventual positive effects upon our own evolution. For we cannot go on as super chimps, pacing restlessly upon a shrinking globe. Still less can we think of the galaxy itself as a great Welt, ready for our primate passions. We need something more. Art and artifice, fiction among them, are our ways of confronting our troubling selves.
Not many writers get that extensive and sensitive a treatment.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible book. And I think the most interesting thing for me is what's not in the book. So there's 40 short stories in there, And as I've started my journey, I said, oh, these must be the best. And then I read another story. I go, well, why wasn't that one in there? That one's that's better. I like that story better than 28 of these other stories. And oh my gosh, what about this story? Why isn't that in there? So it's definitely interesting. I mean, there's got to be 100 stories.
Yeah. Well, there should be a best of Avram Davidson, and there isn't.
It would be this thick.
Well, you got to have some constraints. I mean, I published a best of Gregory Benford about 5 years ago, and it's out of print, of course, but you can still get it in the ebook. But the point is, it forces a coherence on it. I got my old buddy David Hartwell to edit the thing because I felt incompetent to judge him. I published 200 short stories, and I think if you do it, and it should be done and should be doable. Chronological order would be the way I chose, because I did that for my own desktop.
Okay.
And you can see the development.
Yeah, that would be interesting. That'd be a matter of trying to pick out which ones. That would be so hard.
Well, there's no reason you can't self-publish it, because actually they're very good ways. He has such a strong memory and audience, you'd be able to sell it.
So question on that. The audience out there, and I know it's because it's short stories. I mean, I've asked this question before, but why do you think, in your opinion, he isn't better known or
Well, most people these days, the man on the street doesn't know who Archimedes was either. High quality writers of arcane sensitivity, referring to events and people that were around 1,000 years ago, don't have the audience of, say, Star Wars. I mean, he's a distinctive elite taste.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about people now, don't get me started on the millennials, but who a salient plus or minus question is, in what century did the American Civil War occur? Guess the percentage that gets it right. Here's a hint, it's less than 50.
Right.
Point is, the events of medieval society or early European are as remote as Australopithecus for these people. And they don't know Australopithecus either, although I did.
Right.
You lived out just down the street next to Archimedes. So the point is that the past is over for almost everybody. That's the more modern sensibility. The interesting stuff is next day.
Right. Well, anything else that any other stories or anything else that you'd want the world to know about Avram or Grania?
Well, he was terrific company, and many people treated him kindly because they knew he was a kindly man.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Bob Silverberg saying once that he was going to loan some money to Avram because he really needed it, and Avram came over, but he couldn't press the elevator button on the apartment in Riverside Drive in the 1950s. So Bob went down, pushed the button, and went back up because he knew he couldn't open a door or do that. I don't know those rules, but he was very strict. Yeah,
no, he was. And in terms of, in terms of his empathy, I think that shows in a lot of his writing as well. And especially in the story, Now Let Us Sleep. I mean, that in and of itself was a great example of I think, who he was. I mean, there's so many stories.
Right.
Actually, I just talked to Alan Foster, speaking of Star Wars.
Right.
And we actually talked about O'er the Grasses Grow, which I don't know if you remember that story.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I mean, that talk about ahead of the time and an empathetic sort of feeling towards another culture, which I don't think people necessarily had at that time. I think you're right. So
I remember telling Avram the story about Alan Dean Foster, how George Lucas has paid him a bunch more bucks to leave Alan's name off the book and just have George Lucas on the first Star Wars book. And I said, was it worth it? He said, of course it was worth it. I got royalties too. Sold 1 million copies.
Oh.
I mean, Avram was always aware of this. I wish he had continued to edit F&SF.
That's been an interesting debate. Obviously, when he was editing it out of Mexico, married to,
Right.
married.
Did he live in San Miguel de Allende?
I don't remember exactly where. I know he and my mom moved out there, and he was basically editing it from Mexico, but I don't remember exactly where. I have it written down, but I can't remember exactly where.
I think it's true because when I was a graduate student, went to Mexico and went scuba diving in the Yucatan and came back to Mexico City, went up to San Miguel de Allende in order to see the dried corpses, by the way, in the caverns there. I knew of them from a Ray Bradbury story. And Mac Reynolds put me up there for 4 or 5 days and told me Avram Davidson stories.
Oh, wow.
His time in Mexico. Which was mostly that he was a strange semi-teetotaler, and he was fascinated by them and thought about writing stories about them because they were so much like things from apparently 1,000 years ago or something like that. He was very funny about this, saying, he said, I tried to interest him in Marxist labor theory, and he just laughed. As do I. It was fun to remember Avram, and I wish he were better known.
I did
keep the idea of the best of Avram Davidson.
Well, so a couple of things that I'll tell you. One, I'm really excited, and I truly believe this. I was given one of his unpublished novels, and I believe it may. For me, it's one of my favorites. I think it's one of the best.
When did you write it?
What's that?
When did you write it?
So I'm not 100% certain whether it was sometime between, I'm guessing the 70s and 80s is my guess. And I'll tell you more offline because I'm hoping to get it published in next year.
Good.
But yeah, I'll tell you more about that offline because I want people to be excited about it.
That was fine. That's good. Yes, he remarked to me that he really loved having an office in the English department because he could sit there and write. And since he was teaching classes and students, but what they are, he would have copious office hours, certain that no one would show up. And he was right.
Oh my God.
People were impressed with him, and they were kind of, didn't want to disturb him.
Greg, thank you so much.